What's the most body-freezing confession you've heard that someone casually throw into the open? Story 1. When I was a young manager, I had a young woman start working on the team underneath me. She picked up a night shift gap I had but said she would need a ride home because the buses didn't run that late. I agreed because it meant I wouldn't have to stay up until 3 a.m. when I had to be up and working at 5 a.m. And she wasn't even asking for any cash, just a ride. Done. On the way back to her place, she started opening up about her past. Out of nowhere, we had been talking about other shifts she could pick up because she was looking to make more money if there weren't limits on overtime. The personal story she shared? It was the 1-year anniversary of her brother taking his own life. She had found him. She had exhausted the patience of the people who were letting her stay at their rental for free out of sympathy and had run out of the money her brother had left her. He took his life because he couldn't take it anymore. She said he apologized a lot in the note he left, but she understood. Their father had abused them both since they were little, forcing them to do terrible things to each other and to him or their mother. Her older brother knew it was wrong and eventually contacted the police through a school counselor, though it took effort to get people to believe him. The parents were eventually caught and convicted of making and distributing illegal material involving children, among other crimes. The kids went into foster care with no other real family. After he turned 18, her brother found her and tried to help them start fresh in a different city where no one knew them. She was going to school, and he worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads. But he never got past wanting to leave this world, even though he felt responsible for protecting and caring for his sister. I held her hand. I cried. She sat there just wanting someone to listen. I still had to go open the store and do orders and inventory, but I didn't want to leave things like that. I walked her to her door. She clearly wasn't ready to be alone and asked me in. The place wasn't much to look at from the outside. It was worse inside, unfurnished, with only a child's mattress on the floor. She offered me a glass of water and told me she spent most of her time thinking about ending her life, but that the only people who would remember her brother would be their parents, and that wasn't fair. I made her promise not to do anything until I finished work. On my drive back, I remember thinking, to my shame, that the story was too unbelievable. She worked in customer service and had such a bright and cheerful demeanor when dealing with customers. I thought I was being manipulated. Why share all that with your boss? Also, to my regret, I told someone else. When I got in and started my prep, I told the night manager about one of her new staff members and my concerns. She looked it up. She investigated. Her parents had made the papers. There was an obituary for her brother. We were both pretty tough people, but it broke both of us. The night manager cried too. She wasn't scheduled the next couple of days, and she already had a key to my place. I sent her there to disassemble a futon in my guest bedroom that I already planned to replace with a proper bed. It was old but had served me well in college. The night manager and her boyfriend packed it in her car, along with some nightstands and an old coffee maker. Then she dropped off her boyfriend and went over to the girl's house. She knocked on the door and said she was there to drop off the futon the girl had bought from me. Sleepy as she was, the girl saw through the excuse and said, "He told you." The night manager admitted to it but said it was a good thing and that she was there to help. They put the bed together, and the night manager spent most of the morning cleaning and arranging things while talking to her. I'd given her some cash, and she and her boyfriend chipped in, making it feel more like a home. They went to Walmart and Goodwill, even did some dumpster diving, and finished furnishing her place. By then, the night manager had been awake for around 38 hours, so she and the other girl slept on the futon together. I planned to meet up with them later, but they needed the rest. We met the next night instead. After that, the girl often spent time with whoever wasn't working, though she was putting in a lot of hours herself. We tried to help her develop a support network. I wish I could say the story had a happy ending. Maybe if we'd been better people. Maybe if I'd been more sober or cared more back then. But neither of us were sober longer than necessary, and substances were always part of the environment. We cycled through partners often. That first boyfriend the night manager had, he lasted about 2 weeks after that. We never offered her drugs or encouraged her drinking, but it's not like we were sober around her either. I left for a better job and didn't stay in close contact. That girl? I found out from the night manager that not long after I left, she started using substances. She eventually turned to exotic dancing to fund her addiction. And then, she ended her life. Every now and then, when I have a good day, I remember all of that, most of the conversations I had with her. I remember how incredibly cheerful and genuine she seemed with customers, despite everything she carried inside. And I cry. The world should have done better by her. I should have done better by her. Story 2. At a teenage sleepover, my friend told me that the leader of their church had been assaulting her whenever he had the chance, and that she was scared she might be pregnant. Just before that, we had been chatting about Take That versus Backstreet Boys. We were 13. She had written about it in an essay we had been assigned that same week, and our teacher had an absolute meltdown, but in the best possible way. She made it clear none of it was the girl's fault, called her parents in to make absolutely sure they believed her and would support her, called the police, and got social services involved to get her into specialized treatment. Her parents drove her home, and then her father went for a walk to their formerly trusted family friend's house. I heard the police came, but nobody was arrested that night. Rural Norway rules. If you stop right now, I don't have to do paperwork. Don't make me come back. My stepfather mentioned seeing the preacher limping around on crutches, and my mom just said, good. There was a court case. Of course, many people in the church claimed that the 13-year-old had somehow seduced the adult and accused her of ruining the reputation of a good man. But the judge didn't buy it for a second, and that man went to jail in the end. Still, my friend never truly recovered. She tried really hard. She received inpatient treatment for anorexia and self-harm, developed from the stress. Even now as an adult, you can see that she's carrying something heavy wherever she goes. I love you, E. None of that was your fault, sweetheart. I'm so sorry that evil person took so much from you. Story 3. I worked as an editorial assistant, the most junior position, on a magazine that had a very old readership. We often joked that if subscriptions dropped, it was because the subscribers had passed away. The magazine was UK-based, and most of the readers were American. We had an active letter section where people would write in with their memories. It was the 1990s, so everything came through the mail, and I was in charge of handling those letters because nobody else wanted to do it. I found it fascinating. We usually only published cheerful reminiscences, but people wrote about all kinds of things. We frequently got letters asking if we could help find a missing person, which always made me feel sad. After all, there wasn't much a 24-year-old sitting in London could do to find someone's daughter who disappeared in Dublin 30 years ago. But the war stories, oh my goodness, they were incredibly graphic. I won't go into the more routine accounts of wartime violence, but one story in particular still haunts me. If you have a vivid imagination, you may want to stop reading here. A person who had immigrated to the US after the war wrote about his time as a night warden in London during the bombings. He said the one experience he could never forget was when a group of around 30 factory workers sought shelter in a factory basement during an air raid. It should have been safe, except that the factory they worked in used a lot of boiling water. The building took a direct hit and one of the main pipes burst. By the time rescuers cleared the rubble, everyone inside had been either boiled or steamed alive. When they tried to remove the bodies, the flesh would come off the bone in their hands. Like cooked chicken, he said. I have never wanted to unread a letter more than that one. Story 4. In high school, I went to a friend's house to hang out and smoke. This kid was a little sketchy, but I'd known him pretty much my whole life, and we had always been good friends. When I got there, two guys were there that I had never seen before. Those guys proceeded to tell us about what happened the night before. They had helped their friend set his house on fire because he had killed his grandparents with a machete. They told us how they had smoked in the house with the bodies of the grandparents and the dogs he had also killed. The guy who committed the murders had been on a 3-day drug binge. His grandfather had tried to stop him from leaving the house, so he picked up a machete and attacked them. They said he had videos on his phone of him poking his grandmother's eyes with the machete and other extremely disturbing things. This happened in Oklahoma, if anyone's curious. The guy's name was Kyle Smith, and he received life in prison plus 10 years. The two others, the ones who helped him burn the house and stayed there, were also arrested and spent time in prison. Story 5. A few years ago, my mom picked me up so we could grab food on my birthday. Out of nowhere, she brought up a memory from when we had gone to Disney for a cheerleading competition I was in. The only thing I had asked for during the trip, besides food, was this round Minnie Mouse plushie filled with soft, squishy beads. It was so squishy and soft, and I took it to my mom and asked if I could have it. She said no, and I just assumed it was a typical parent no for no real reason. That day in the car, she casually explained why I ended up getting it on the last day of the trip. At the time, she and my biological dad were still married, and he had drained their joint bank account at a strip club. Her friend, who was with us because her daughter was also on the team, had to cover dinner for us that night. I had no idea. The next morning, my mom had to call her job and ask for a paycheck advance to cover the next 3 days, since we weren't leaving until Saturday morning and our resort package only included breakfast. That meant we would have had no food for over 3 days. I already disliked my biological dad by that point, but I couldn't believe he'd be that reckless. I believed he would do something irresponsible, but not that he'd leave me and my mom without food for days. I still have that plushie, by the way. It's in my closet. My biological dad? No contact. Story 6. I have a family member with dementia. She can't remember names but recognizes faces, and she has difficulty communicating. I brought some old family photos to give us something to talk about, thinking she might enjoy seeing them. When I showed her a photo of her uncle, she suddenly became serious and incredibly clear-headed. She said he had assaulted her sisters and that her older sister had once tried to convince her to visit him so that she wouldn't have to endure it anymore. But she had refused to go over there. He lived next door. That one choice created a lifetime of bad blood between her and her older sister. I had always known they didn't get along, but I never knew why. Hearing her recount this story so clearly, with names and detail, was shocking. I hadn't seen her that lucid in years. The strange part is, I knew Uncle D. We had visited his house many times, and I had fond memories of him. So now I'm left wondering, was this some false story created by her dementia? Or was it a real memory, one that left such a deep scar that even dementia couldn't erase it? Story 7. One of my mom's friends, a small and friendly older man, once gave me a job at the cleaning service company where he worked. I was 18, and it was easy money. He was chatty and helpful, and over lunch one day, he started talking about how he didn't hear well in one ear. Then he casually told me he had been tortured in his home country, a Latin American country that had been under military rule at the time. He described being tortured with electric shocks and slaps to the ear until he passed out. When he regained consciousness, he found himself in a mass grave. He figured they had thought he was dead and dumped him there. He woke up, crawled out from among the bodies, and somehow made it home. This tiny, kind old man had survived something that the word hell barely even begins to describe. The kind of trauma that would destroy most people. And instead, he survived. He told death to get lost and went on to live a life full of kindness, humor, and peace. It redefined the word tough for me. Tough isn't always loud or muscular. Sometimes it's someone who has seen the worst things imaginable and still chooses to enjoy life because they've seen the alternative. Story 8. My grandmother married a man almost 20 years younger than herself shortly after my sister and I were born. When we were about 2 years old, our mother went into a psychiatric facility and we were placed in our grandmother's care. About 4 or 5 months later, my sister developed what my grandmother thought was a urinary tract infection, but upon medical examination, it was discovered that she had contracted gonorrhea. Long story short, an investigation was opened, and my grandmother's husband was arrested. Nearly 2 decades passed, and although my grandmother had divorced this man, she remained friends with his 2 sisters, one of whom was about 15 years younger than their brother. During a 4th of July celebration, both sisters attended. They informed my grandmother that her ex-husband had been released from prison and was now living in a facility for offenders. That's when the older sister dropped a shocking comment. It didn't stop him last time, and it won't stop him this time. We all stared at her, stunned. What do you mean last time? Apparently, just before marrying my grandmother, he had been released from a mental institution. He was hospitalized after being caught abusing his youngest sister. The entire family knew he had a history of this behavior and kept it quiet, hoping that because his first offense occurred when he was technically a minor, 17, the hospital stay had cured him. Then after he reoffended, they chose not to mention any of this for nearly 2 decades, while remaining close to our family, the same one devastated by what he had done. Needless to say, we all cut off contact with them. Story 9. I was at an engagement party when an older man began talking about an experience he had while working in a town that had recently been affected by an ethnic-based civil conflict. He and his co-workers had discovered that a group of men from one side of the conflict had been assaulting young girls, primary school age, from the other side. He said that he and his co-workers decided the only way to stop it was to track down where the men lived. Then over the course of one night, they went to each house, executed them, and left the bodies in the street as a warning to others who might try to do the same thing. He didn't express remorse for what they did. What haunted him more was what those men had been doing. I remember him saying something like, "Those men had no reason to be alive." I won't mention more about where or when this happened. The topic came up because another guest at the party was from a place very close to where it occurred. Story 10. I used to work nights at a hotel. One week, I was scheduled for the latter half and missed the fact that we were housing a family friend of the general manager. This family friend was an elderly lady, at least in her early 80s. She came down to the front desk around midnight looking for a bottle of water and ended up staying until about 3 a.m., just chatting with me about general life stories. It was a quiet night, so I didn't mind. Then she told me why she was really there. She had been deemed mentally unfit to be unsupervised and had attempted to leave the state with her friends against her husband's permission. He was her designated supervisor. She ran off anyway, which led to the police having to track her down. Her kids decided to house her at the hotel for a while. She then started talking about her husband, explaining how much she hated him because of the trauma he had caused their son, forcing him to work a dangerous logging job in his early 20s, which resulted in a serious injury. She shared multiple stories about that. To top it off, she told me that her kids were supposed to bring her medication, but hadn't, and that it had been 3 days. One of the medications was lithium, along with a mix of antipsychotic and age-related medications. She said she was prescribed lithium because she had once hated her husband so much that she tried to run him over with her car. She had been institutionalized for a few weeks after that. I made an excuse to step into the back office to get out of the conversation. Before I did, she asked if she could be moved to a different room because she wanted a better view. I deferred the request to the morning manager, since we didn't usually honor that type of request. Flash forward to the next morning. While I was training a new breakfast worker, this lady had a full-on psychotic episode and ended up sitting in the dining area wearing nothing but a bath towel. That's an entirely different story, but I thought it was necessary to include. Story 11. This isn't exactly a confession, more like an incredibly uncomfortable offer. I had been single for a while and wasn't too bothered by it. I just wasn't in the right headspace for dating. One day I went to catch up with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. During a conversation about relationships, he suddenly offered to let me sleep with his girlfriend. For money. I thought he was joking at first. He was absolutely serious. His girlfriend wasn't there, and she definitely had no say in this so-called arrangement. She wasn't a S-worker or anything, just a regular woman in a relationship. We did not remain friends. Over time, I found out a lot more about how controlling and abusive he had been toward her. I have no idea what happened to either of them in the end, but I do know she eventually left him with the help of her friends and family. Story 12. A couple of friends and I were on vacation in Amsterdam. We were sitting in the lounge of a coffee shop smoking when a guy walked in. He was really chill, originally from the UK, but had moved to the Netherlands a while back. It was just the four of us in that lounge, casually talking, mostly about motorcycles and stuff. At some point, my friend asked him why he moved to the Netherlands. As he began to explain, his expression slowly changed into that distant, thousand-yard stare. He said he used to live in the UK and that one night someone broke into his house while he was there. He got up, fought the burglar, and managed to knock him out. He tied the guy up and called the police. But the police never showed up. He thought they just didn't believe him. He kept calling. An hour passed, and the burglar was still tied up inside his home. Out of frustration and fear, he dragged the guy outside, poured gasoline on him, lit a lighter, and then called the police again. He held the phone near the tied-up man and screamed, "Help me! He's going to kill me! He's going to burn me alive!" That's when the police finally showed up. They arrested both of them. In the end, both went to prison. After his release, the man started a new life in the Netherlands. And the way he told the story, the silence, the distant look, made it feel very real. We all sat there in silence after he finished, unsure of what to say. Then he snapped out of it, and we continued our conversation like normal. But honestly, we were nervous for the rest of the night. Story 13. We were standing around at work. Maybe 5 or 6 of us just making jokes and telling stories. Even the boss was hanging out. One of the newer guys started telling a story like it was going to be funny, something for everyone to laugh at. He said he and his cousin went to a party trying to hook up with a couple of girls. They paired off, but his cousin got rejected and stormed off home, leaving him behind. Later, he woke up drunk and realized his cousin wasn't there. He panicked, thinking something bad had happened. Then out of nowhere, he pulled out a knife and demanded the girls' phones. He kept asking what they had done to his cousin, convinced they had hurt him or had someone else do it. He held them there, terrifying them, demanding answers. Eventually, his cousin called him and admitted he just got angry and left after being rejected. The guy gave their phones back and just sat in their apartment until his cousin came back to pick him up. Everyone was just staring at him, speechless. My boss walked away halfway through the story, probably so he wouldn't be part of that conversation. I said, I would probably never tell that story again if I were you. I have a daughter, and it terrifies me that a night of innocent fun could bring her face to face with someone like that. He didn't seem to care about how much he scared those girls. To him, it was just a funny misunderstanding. Story 14. There was this guy I used to hang out with now and then for about 6 months before we lost touch. My wife and I got along okay with him and his family, but we didn't really click as close friends. A few years later, he showed up out of nowhere, looking to talk to someone familiar. I'd been through tough times myself, so I invited him in and asked how he'd been. He started explaining that he was stressed out. His wife had recently gotten injured and told him it was okay to seek romance elsewhere to cope. They were in an open relationship. But instead of making any kind of rational decision, he texted his 12-year-old stepdaughter and her 13-year-old friend about it. He told me the whole story from his perspective and then said, I told her she couldn't buy a new movie, so she stole my phone and sent all those texts to her and her friends' phones to get back at me. Then he casually said he was taking a plea deal and going to jail for 5 years. We didn't say anything remotely supportive. He just got up and left. Now he's on a registry for life. Even he didn't seem to believe his own excuse about the text messages. We ended up moving before he got out of prison. That wasn't the only reason we left, but it was the start of our maybe we shouldn't live here much longer discussions. Story 15. One day, out of nowhere, my dad opened up about the last time he saw his father. Apparently, his dad was an alcoholic who used to beat my dad, his brother, and their mother after nights of drinking. One night, my dad and his brother had had enough. They stayed up waiting for their father to come home. As soon as their dad walked through the door, my uncle threw a heavy raincoat over his head. Then both of them started beating him. My dad said he kept hitting him for about 10 minutes, even after his brother told him he'd gone limp. Eventually, he snapped out of it. They dragged their father outside into the street in the middle of the night and never saw him again. My dad told me all this while we were out driving on an errand. Then he added, You're about to meet your great-uncle, my uncle, who I haven't seen in decades. He knows where your grandfather is. We got to this house, met my great-uncle, and had a brief catch-up. Then he told my dad that their father had recently passed away in a hospital from cancer. Even though my great-uncle had a way to contact my dad, he never did. He offered no explanation and refused to talk about what my grandfather's life had been like all those years, other than confirming he remained an alcoholic. That was the most I've ever learned about my family, before or since, and it was a lot to take in as an 11-year-old. Years later, I realized something else. My dad lost both his father and his brother under similar circumstances. He had beaten both of them before they stopped speaking, and both of them later died of cancer as alcoholics. Story 16. My mother once told me what finally made her decide to leave my father. They had an age gap marriage. She was 20 when they married, and he was in his 40s, a Vietnam War veteran with severe PTSD and a dangerous addiction to meth. One night, after a drug-fueled bender, he had a flashback episode. He had no idea where he was, when it was, or who was around him. I was just a toddler, about 14 months old, and he went into my room, picked me up from my crib, and began holding me like a hostage. My mother said he was pointing a firearm at my head, screaming at her and my infant brother to stay back. He even fired the weapon in the house, though thankfully no one was physically harmed. He was arrested soon after. The strange part? She didn't leave right away. It took her another year or so to finally walk away. Then 2 summers ago, she got extremely drunk. She leaned over and whispered in my ear, asking if I remembered whether or not I had enjoyed it when my father had assaulted me as a toddler. That moment was chilling. I had always sensed something had happened to me because of certain medical and psychological struggles growing up, but I had no idea that's what it was. And she said it so casually, so cruelly. Someone once said, "You can't choose your family," and that's never felt more true. My father lost all parental rights long ago. He later had another daughter and gave her the same name as mine, which is disturbing. My mother has been cut off completely and removed from every corner of my life. I just try to keep going and be the person people describe me as today, but I carry a lot of darkness most never see. Story 17. I've shared this before, but it still sticks with me. I used to work in a rough warehouse, the kind of place that would hire almost anyone. One day, a new guy started. I'll call him Bill. He had this wide-eyed, slightly off look, but if you talked to him, he seemed intelligent and friendly. He always wore baggy jeans. One day, he scratched his leg and lifted his pants slightly. That's when I noticed the ankle monitor. I was surprised because I thought our company ran background checks. That's when I found out the company actually worked with the prison system to hire individuals from halfway houses. Bill had been in prison for over 10 years. He told me that much, but never shared what his conviction was for. He was always secretive about it. Eventually, rumors started going around. People said he had served time for sexual assault. My curiosity got the better of me, so I looked up his record online. It wasn't a woman he had harmed. It was a 16-year-old girl. I didn't tell anyone what I found, but from that moment on, I saw him very differently. Then one day, Bill told me something unsettling. He said he had been riding his bike to Walmart when he saw a pretty woman, and it made him feel funny. He said he panicked and rode away quickly because he was afraid he'd act on impulse. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and replied, "Oh, wow." And that was it. But I never felt the same around him again. Story 18. My grandfather was sitting at the dining room table one day when he suddenly began to cry. I asked him what was wrong, and he simply said he was remembering the little Italian soldier who saved his life. My grandfather had served as a paratrooper in the French Foreign Legion, 3RF. He was stationed in Algeria during the conflict and saw a lot of action. But this one story haunted him the most. They were out on patrol and my grandfather was the point man. He was relatively new at the time. Another soldier, an Italian, came up beside him and told him to stop and check their surroundings. The area was perfect for an ambush. My grandfather scanned the area ahead, and just then, the Italian shouted, "Get down!" He shoved my grandfather to the ground and fired a burst toward their right. Return fire erupted immediately and the Italian went down. My grandfather's unit took cover and fought back. He dragged the Italian behind cover and started helping the medic. The man had taken a shot to the abdomen and was bleeding badly. The medic stabilized him and said he needed to be airlifted immediately. Eventually, the firing slowed down and the enemy appeared to retreat. A helicopter arrived and they loaded the Italian soldier on a stretcher. But as the helicopter lifted, the enemy began firing again. The pilot tried to bank sharply to avoid the attack, and the stretcher slipped. My grandfather watched the Italian fall from the helicopter and hit the ground with a loud thud, raising a cloud of dust. He landed in open ground. No one could reach him despite trying. The pilot had to fly off. This time the unit didn't wait. They launched a counterattack fueled by rage and grief and didn't stop until they were certain there would be no more ambushes. You can imagine what that likely meant. When it was safe, my grandfather ran to where the Italian had landed. He didn't survive the fall. My grandfather saw a lot during his service, but this was the moment that stayed with him the most. A man who saved his life died in front of him. He blamed himself for the blood, for the loss. Even decades later, he couldn't stand the sight of blood without becoming physically ill. He said it was also the first time he ever took a life out of pure anger, and it haunted him forever. It was the only story he ever told about his time in Algeria, because as he put it, it was the worst day of his life. Story 19. I'm from South Africa, and something that happened recently reminded me of this story. I was in a mixed group setting, chatting with a fairly new friend. His grandfather owned a large amount of land in the interior, somewhere between Bloemfontein and Colesberg, for those familiar with the area. Some of the land was active farmland. A small portion was reserved for game, but the majority of it was unused. We were talking casually about farm life and the hunting trips they took when he dropped what he thought was a funny story. Apparently, they found out that some of the farm workers' families were considering filing a small ancestral land claim on one of the unused parcels. When his grandfather heard about this, he gathered some of the family and immediately went out and bulldozed every old grave they could find, just to eliminate any evidence of prior residence. We all stood there in stunned silence. No one laughed. I still vividly remember that moment, even though it happened over a decade ago. The worst part? He was genuinely confused as to why people were upset and began lecturing him about how wrong it was. Story 20. I was having a conversation with a coworker about relationships when he suddenly smiled and said, I warned my wife and her mother that if my wife ever cheats on me, I'll cut off her head with an axe and leave it in front of her mother's door. So her mother knows what kind of person her daughter really was. He has 2 children with her. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say. He just continued talking about something else, as if he hadn't just said that. Sadly, that wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that. A taxi driver once told me something very similar. He said his wife had asked for a divorce, and he told her the only way she'd be leaving him was if he killed her. When I asked why he would say something so disturbing instead of just giving her the divorce she wanted, he said he had invested too much in her and couldn't let her go live a happy life with another man. Story 21. When I was 16, I was at a bonfire party with some new friends I'd met during a short course. We were drinking cider and playing Never Have I Ever. One guy said, Never have I ever killed someone, and then drank. We all froze. Someone asked him what he meant. He said that back home he had been part of a gang and that his initiation had required him to take someone's life. He told us not to tell anyone. He didn't make a direct threat, but the implication was definitely there. He was from another country and had a very common name, so there wasn't much we could do. Also, when I was 16, I went on a road trip with my parents. We were on our way to visit a mountain village when my dad picked up a hitchhiker. He loved meeting people and wasn't small, so he usually felt pretty safe. But something about this guy felt off from the start. We told him where we were going, and he suddenly claimed to be a police officer investigating a series of assaults in that same village. Then he turned to me, grinning, and said, You better be careful up there. You might have to earn your money in a different way. I froze. I just laughed nervously. We dropped him off as quickly as possible and never spoke of it again. But that moment has stayed with me ever since. Story 22. About 10 years ago, I went on a date with someone I thought was a nice guy. He was a Marine. I was visiting my hometown near Camp Pendleton. We'd been texting for about a month while I was away at college. He invited me out, and we ended up at a bar with some of his friends. I had a couple of shots with them and then went up to the bar to ask for water. A random woman came up to me and told me that those guys had drugged and assaulted her, and it was about to happen to me. I froze in place. I started frantically calling and texting all my closest friends, begging them to come get me. I remember sitting on a bar stool staring at the ceiling lights, waiting for my best friend. That's the last thing I remember from that night. The next morning, I woke up at the barracks in Camp Pendleton, unclothed. It took me years to recover from that, and even now it still hurts to think about. Story 23. I've got one scary story and one a bit more fun. Let's start with the scary one. I worked at a restaurant with this guy and ended up becoming pretty close friends with him. We often went out drinking, smoking, and hanging out late. He used to tell me stories about his rough childhood, how he was physically abused by his father and bullied in school because of a speech issue. One night after a long shift and some heavy drinking, we were walking to his place when he casually told me that he used to harm animals, specifically cats, when he was younger. He described doing awful things like setting one on fire, tying another to a rock and throwing it in a pond, and more. The worst part was when he described skinning one alive and said, with a chuckle, that they live longer than you'd think. It completely changed the way I saw him. Now for the fun one. My wife's grandmother was an eccentric artist who lived in a massive house with almost no furniture, just a mattress on the floor. She spent all her time working on her art, which covered every wall. She lived in Alabama after World War II and had been part of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP. While she didn't fly, she worked radar operations. Over dinner one night, she casually said she'd been sworn to secrecy back then, but their primary mission was to track unidentified flying objects over the Gulf of Mexico. She claimed to have personally tracked 12 of them and said the team had documented many more. Story 24. I once gave a ride home to a guy I worked with, and during the drive, he casually started talking about two women he had assaulted. One of them had gotten drunk at his place and tried to leave, but he trapped her in a closet and forced her to perform a S-act on him. The second involved him and a friend taking a woman to a park under the pretense of smoking together. He said they took turns assaulting her while the other held her down. He told me all of this like it was just a regular story, like he was recounting something totally normal. It didn't surprise me much that he was a creep. He'd always made inappropriate comments about women. What did shock me was that his friend, the other guy he mentioned, was someone I had thought was really sweet. I did not see that coming. The police were contacted, but unfortunately, the case went nowhere because it turned into a he said, she said situation, and I didn't know who the victims were. Still, I made it my mission to get the word out. I shared what I knew across social media and tagged his profile to make sure people knew who he was. Story 25. My grandmother once casually told me about the time my mom almost attacked my grandfather. We were doing the dishes together, just chatting, when she suddenly mentioned how glad she was that her ex-husband had passed away. She said she was tired of pretending to be sad about it. She started talking about how he was a heavy drinker and how he used to abuse both her and my mom. That part I already knew. I had overheard family members talk about it many times. But then she told me a story I had never heard. One night he came home drunk and started throwing her around the room while my mom cried. Then he grabbed something and smashed a window. He found money they had been hiding from him and started heading back out. That's when my mom, just a kid, grabbed a piece of shattered glass and ran at him, screaming that she was going to hurt him. My grandma had to hold her back until she calmed down. After sharing that story, my grandmother went right back to talking about the good old days and how much better things used to be. Meanwhile, I stood there having an existential crisis. As a kid, I used to love my grandfather. I thought he was such a kind, gentle man. Story 26. I used to work as a counselor, so I heard a lot of disturbing stories. But one moment that truly froze me came from a man who told me he had tried to strangle his wife because she accidentally spilled water on his computer keyboard. His wife was sitting next to him laughing like it was no big deal. I just sat there in silence, stunned. I am convinced he was a sociopath or psychopath. I absolutely hated having them in sessions. He always tried to make me uncomfortable, to get a reaction out of me. Eventually, I transferred them to a more experienced counselor who specialized in domestic violence. I never saw them again. In my personal life, one of the worst moments was when someone casually told me they had assaulted a 6-year-old girl years ago. It had happened when he was a teenager, and the victim was his best friend's younger sister. He said he snuck into her room while she was sleeping. I was a mandated reporter at the time, so I told my supervisor immediately. But since it had happened over 15 years earlier, and I had no proof or identifying information, there was sadly nothing that could be done beyond documentation. Story 27. This one might count. Back in college, I had a part-time job grading mandatory essay papers. Many states require students to respond to writing prompts, which are then sent to neutral agencies to be scored. One prompt I remember was from Nebraska. It featured a cartoon mouse dressed as a detective, and all the fifth graders had to write a story about it. Most of the essays were harmless, boring, and repetitive, but easy enough to grade. Then came the New Jersey eighth graders. The prompt was, tell us about a time you gave a friend advice. But it might as well have been, tell us the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to you. Easily 10 to 15% of the essays were heart-wrenching. I learned to quickly scan for the phrase, I told them this was wrong, and they should talk to their mom or maybe a teacher. Those were the ones we flagged. Some essays were first-hand accounts of abuse, and others were detailed second-hand stories. Several graders quit in tears. They couldn't handle it emotionally. Eventually, we had to set up a direct pipeline to officials in New Jersey to handle reports. If we saw certain key phrases or enough detail, we flagged and referred them. The pile of referral paperwork at the front desk grew larger with every shift. By the time we got to grading Newark submissions, I made a personal rule. If I read 3 abuse stories in a row, I was done for the day. I remember hitting that limit 3 separate times. Story 28. Back in the 1980s, while touring through southern Spain, I met a group of retired British people who had served as part of the Home Guard during World War II. What I didn't understand at the time, but quickly came to realize, was that many British citizens genuinely believed German occupation was inevitable, especially after France fell. These Home Guard members, often portrayed as something of a joke, had actually been trained in deadly serious skills. They knew how to kill. They were trained in creating improvised explosives from household products, sabotage, smuggling techniques, coding messages, and espionage. They even knew how to use distraction tactics, like having a young woman flirt with a soldier just long enough for someone to silently eliminate him with a blade to the neck. It was intense stuff, survivalist and brutal. But rather than let those skills go to waste, these people ended up using their expertise in smuggling to support humanitarian efforts. For example, they found ways to hide food in shipping containers so that at least some of it made it to civilians in African conflict zones instead of being seized by soldiers. Story 29. I usually tell this one pretty simply, but here's the full story. I was about 11 years old, sitting in the car when a debate came on the radio about abortion, pro-choice versus pro-life. I told my mom I could never get an abortion because I believed all life was valuable. That moment stands out to me because, at that point in my life, I had already been through so much. I'd been abused by my mom, removed by Child Protective Services in the middle of the night, and had periods of homelessness with her. And still, nothing had left me as speechless as what she said next. Without turning to look at me, she just stared forward and said, "I was going to get an abortion with you. I wanted to." I looked at her shocked. She kept talking. Maybe I asked her a question. But she went on to explain that she had gotten pregnant after reconnecting with my biological dad, who she'd met in a recovery program. When he denied the pregnancy, she moved back home to a different state. She ended up getting back together with an abusive ex and planned to terminate the pregnancy. She told me she had already had one abortion before. Then she dropped something even more shocking. The abusive boyfriend beat her every day trying to make her miscarry. He pushed her downstairs, hit her stomach with objects, anything he could. But one night, alone and desperate, she felt something speak to her. She said she believed it was God, telling her that this baby, me, was created for a purpose. From that moment, she said she knew she couldn't go through with it. She stopped using drugs and fled back to my biological dad, and that's when my stepdad entered the picture. That was the day I became pro-choice. My mom had been hurting me on purpose for years and had changed her mind. That single decision shaped my whole life. I didn't say anything to her at the time, but I hated myself for a while after that conversation. My mom had a horrific past. Everything she did to me and my brother had been done to her, multiplied. She rarely talked about what her life was like before foster care. I do feel for her, in a way. She gave me the same start in life her parents gave her. I just got opportunities she never did, and I've tried to make better choices. Still, hearing that as an 11-year-old completely changed how I saw everything. Story 30. My grandparents casually dropped a bombshell one day about almost giving my dad up for adoption. I later told my dad, and he was absolutely shocked. He had no idea. Over time, he reflected on it and said a lot of things from his childhood started to make sense. The story itself isn't nearly as harsh as it sounds, but here's the context. My grandparents were non-Jewish German citizens. They came from fairly normal to upper-class families during World War II. They were too young to be involved in the Nazi youth movement, probably around 10 years old at the time. They met after the war, got married, and eventually had 2 kids. My dad was the third. At some point, my grandmother's sister, who was unable to have children, asked if she could adopt their third baby, my dad. It nearly happened, but my grandmother backed out at the last minute because she just couldn't go through with it. After that, they had my dad and eventually immigrated to the United States. They ended up having 6 boys in total. My dad's big realization was how differently his aunt had always treated him. She would give him extra special birthday presents, more attention, more affection. He never understood why until this came out. She had nearly raised him as her own. It suddenly made a lot more sense. This whole story came out casually during a weekend trip I took to visit my grandparents. My grandpa liked to drink his bush beer and often shared old stories after a few. That day, they told us a lot more family secrets. I think they knew they were getting older and just wanted someone to hear them. My grandpa was about 88 at the time. He passed away 2 years ago at 93. My wife and I still talk about that visit. It was one of those rare days where decades of unspoken family history just spilled out. and it was unforgettable. Story 32. When I was a teenager, I had a fear of flying. So my parents let me take a bus from San Francisco to Salt Lake City to visit my grandparents. The ride left late, and we passed through small casino towns in Nevada just as the sun was rising. It was surreal and unexpectedly beautiful. At one stop, an older hippie guy got on the bus and sat near me, next to two teenagers who had that wannabe gangster vibe. They started talking, and it turned out they all had spent some time in prison. The teens had been locked up for minor, typical teenage stuff, but the hippie, his story was different. He told them he had done serious time for beating a man into a coma. He spoke about it with such coldness and detachment, like it was just some random thing that happened to him, not something he was actually responsible for. He even said his sentence was extended because the victim died from the injuries, while the hippie was still in prison. But the way he said it, you'd think the guy had died just to spite him. It was chilling how he treated such a horrific act like it was just bad luck. After that story, the two teens stopped talking entirely. You could tell they realized they were dealing with someone way outside their experience. The rest of the bus ride was quiet. Everyone stayed silent after that. Story 33. As part of my training to become a clinical psychologist, I spent a year at a forensic psychiatric hospital, the kind of facility where individuals go if they've been declared not guilty by reason of insanity, or if they've been found unfit to stand trial. One of my roles involves sitting down one-on-one with patients to gather an updated assessment of their understanding of the crimes they had been charged with. Each session lasted about an hour. I would ask them to walk me through everything: what happened, how they were feeling at the time, what they believe happened now, and their attitudes about it today. Then I had to write a formal report to be submitted for review, both for educational purposes and to help refine the patient's treatment plan within the hospital. Over the course of that year, I conducted around 50 of these interviews. The charges range from assault to sexual offenses, including against both adults and minors, murder, and in some cases, even cannibalism. Yes, there was a patient who openly confessed to having eaten part of a loved one. That year changed the way I saw everything. It's one thing to read about horrific crimes in the news. It's another to sit across from the person who committed them and hear them calmly describe the details. Story 34. My parents divorced when I was 2, so I never really remembered them being together. They handled split custody really well, and growing up I just assumed they separated due to having different lifestyles and careers. When I was 10, my mom passed away from an aneurysm, and my dad took me in full-time. He raised me on his own after that, made sure I got to college, and eventually met my now stepmother, who's absolutely wonderful. In 2022, when I was 27, my dad and I were having a beer together, just chatting about life, family, and the past. Nothing too deep, until he casually said, "Well, after your mom cheated on me is when I started the divorce stuff." I stopped and asked, "Excuse me?" He went on, "Yeah, your mom's family and I had an agreement. They were supposed to tell you when you were a teenager." That never happened. I had no idea my mom had cheated on him. I checked with a few family members on her side and thought back on certain memories. And yeah, it all added up. She had. My dad could have gone to court, taken full custody, shut her out of my life, and still been legally justified. But he didn't. He put my well-being first. He never said a bad word about her. He was nothing but respectful, even kind to her, for my sake. He's a good dad. He'll be 65 this year, and I'll be 30. I'm honored to be his son. Story 35. An older gentleman once opened up to me about something that completely floored me. He told me that years ago he had sold fentanyl on the streets. He said he knew for a fact that it had led to multiple deaths. He remembered the faces of the people it harmed. He said those memories haunted him every day. Now he delivers pizza for a living and tries to be as kind and compassionate as he possibly can to everyone he meets. But deep down, he feels irreparably tainted, like nothing he does can ever bring those people back. He told me he'd accepted that truth a long time ago. I've worked in retail for years and have dealt with all kinds of people, many of them older, sick, or socially isolated. But that moment caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. The only thing that came to mind was, we've lost a lot of people to fentanyl. You can't undo what's happened, only make different choices moving forward. I haven't seen him since, but I think about him sometimes. I hope he's doing okay. Story 36. This wasn't exactly a confession, but it was one of the most jarring, unexpected things I've ever heard someone say, and it came out of nowhere. At my first professional job, there was a coworker I'll call Jane. She was a small, quiet woman, likely in her late 30s, though her graying hair made her seem older. She reminded me of Velma from the old Scooby-Doo cartoons, just with longer hair. We rarely interacted. The only times we spoke were at the copy machine, where we'd exchange polite greetings and go on with our day. One afternoon, we ended up at the machine at the same time. As usual, we said hello, and then she started talking about how stressful her week had been. I thought she was just venting about normal life stuff, deadlines at work, kids acting up, that kind of thing. I nodded along listening. Then completely out of nowhere, she told me that just the night before, she had been in the car with her husband. They were arguing. At some point, he pulled the car off the road into the woods, reached into the glove box, and pulled out a handgun. He deactivated the safety and pressed it to her head. She said he began rambling, saying he was tired of her, asking her if disagreeing with him was worth her life. At one point, he even mused aloud about how their kids would cope if she was gone, and he went to prison. And then he put the gun away, drove back onto the road like nothing had happened, and they continued their evening. I was 26 at the time, and I just stood there absolutely stunned. Jane finished the story and walked off, leaving me completely disturbed and unsure how to react. Looking back, I don't think she expected or wanted a response. I think she was still processing what had happened and just needed someone, anyone, to hear her say it out loud. It's been years since that day. This was in 2017, but I hadn't thought about it again until now. It still gives me chills. Story 37. I have many stories, but this one stands out. When I was very young, maybe around 7 years old, my mom began opening up to me about some of her traumas. Like others have shared, it seemed like she just needed to get it out, and I happened to be the one she confided in. I was far too young to hear these things, but looking back, it's helped me understand her better. We don't get along very well today, but knowing what she went through puts a lot into perspective. The first story she told me was about when she was around 4 years old. Her father took her little kitten outside and killed it in front of her. Another time she told me about something much darker. She said that when she was a teenager, a boy she'd never met before pulled up beside her in a convertible and invited her to go for a ride. Once they started driving, he pulled out a bag of silver paint and began inhaling it. She said that by the time he pulled over, the paint was all over his mouth and nose. Then he assaulted her on the ground. I don't think she ever told anyone else about it. At one point, I asked her why she had divorced my dad, as young kids often do. She told me he had been addicted to alcohol, would stay out drinking all night, and would come home and leave the front door wide open. She said that once, they got into an argument while he was holding baby me, and he pushed her while drunk. I was there, but I don't remember it, thankfully. She also told me that when she was little, her brother, my uncle, forced her into something unspeakable. The same man touched me inappropriately at a family Christmas gathering when I was a child. At the time, I didn't fully understand what had happened, but it stayed with me. Years later, well into my 20s, I finally learned that my dad wasn't just an alcoholic. He had also been addicted to cocaine and heroin. He would sometimes come home with needles still in his shirt pockets. Apparently, he even burned down his parents' house by accident while high. And then, one of the most shocking stories. It turns out my family has owned farmland for generations, and some of our relatives were buried on that land. One day, during an argument, my great-grandfather dug up the skull of my great-grandmother's sister, who was buried on the property, and showed it to his wife just to upset her. After hearing all of these stories over the years, things about my family started making more sense. I've had an incredibly difficult time with both of my parents, and honestly, I could go on and on about everything I've learned. The more I uncover, the more I realize just how deep the dysfunction runs. Story 38. I was raised in a conservative Christian household where admitting to same-sex attraction could get you disowned and kicked out. My parents often used words like disgusting, sinful, shameful, and abomination whenever they talked about people who were open about their orientation. Whether it was someone on TV, in public, or even an old friend online. It made things incredibly difficult for me as a bishop woman. I had to keep that part of myself hidden for so long, so hidden in fact, that I didn't even fully acknowledge it until I was married to my husband. He's the one who gently pointed out and continued to love and accept me, just as I was. We're both Christians, but definitely not the kind my parents are. Our version of faith is rooted in love and grace, not judgment and exclusion. So imagine my surprise, actually, my anger, when one day my mom casually confessed that she doesn't find men physically attractive. She said, "They do nothing for me." Then, completely unbothered, she added, "But boobs?" and snapped her fingers, saying they could immediately turn her on. I was stunned. I didn't say a word, mostly because I knew my mother couldn't handle the weight of her own confession. She wouldn't survive the emotional fallout if she realized that the last 37 years of her marriage to my dad, decades of feeling no desire and avoiding intimacy, were likely the result of being a closeted lesbian. She wouldn't be able to process it, let alone admit it to herself. So I kept quiet. I've never brought it up again, but I've kept this information tucked away in the back of my mind, should the day ever come when I feel the need to remind her of the very thing she's always condemned in others. Maybe then, she'd finally understand how deep hypocrisy can run, even in a house built on faith. Story 39. Many years ago, I was playing World of Warcraft with a great group of people. We were in a hardcore guild, playing daily, and over time, we became close. Some of us even developed real friendships. One member brought in his younger brother, a 17-year-old who was going to join our raid group. At first, I found him kind of annoying, but over the months, I started to warm up to him. We began chatting more, and he started opening up to me. He asked for advice about school, relationships, and his dreams. He once told me that he had fallen in love with a girl and really wanted to be a better person and have a girlfriend. But then he added, almost jokingly, that if he didn't manage to by the time he turned 18, he didn't want to live anymore. A couple of months later, he said goodbye to the guild and invited us all to TeamSpeak, kind of like Discord, but older. He played us a beautiful piece on the piano as a thank you for the time we'd spent together. He said he had to focus on his real life now. Not long after, his brother messaged me to say he had gone missing. His family was searching for him, and some people thought he might have run away. A year later, a geologist discovered his remains. He had taken his own life. It broke my heart. Looking back, the things he said to me feel haunting now. I wish I had realized how serious he was. Story 40. This wasn't exactly a conversation. It was letters, but it stuck with me for life. I once worked as an editorial assistant at a magazine with a very elderly readership. We used to joke that when subscription numbers dropped, it probably meant the reader had passed away. The magazine was UK-based, but most of the audience was American. We had an active readers' letters page, and in the 90s, everything came through the mail. I was assigned to manage it. No one else wanted to, but I found it fascinating. Most of the letters were upbeat memories, which we published. But many people also wrote to us with serious, often tragic stories, especially about war. Sometimes people even asked if we could help find someone who had disappeared decades ago. I was only 24, sitting in an office in London, and I felt helpless reading those kinds of requests. But the war letters, those were something else. Many were incredibly graphic. One that I will never forget came from someone who had immigrated to the US after the war. He'd worked as a night warden in London during the bombings. He wrote about how, during an air raid, a group of 30 or so factory workers sheltered in the basement of their building. It should have been safe, but the factory used massive amounts of boiling water for its operations, and a direct hit ruptured one of the main pipes. When rescuers finally cleared the rubble, the steam had filled the basement. Everyone inside had died. The writer described how, when they tried to recover the bodies, the flesh would slip off the bones like cooked chicken. It was a horrifying image, one I can never unsee, and it reminded me how deep and brutal human history can be. Story 42. Back in 2015, when I was 20, I went to the bank on a Saturday morning. This particular branch only had the drive-thru open on weekends. While waiting in line, I noticed an older woman standing in the drive-thru lane between my car and the one in front of me. She walked up to my window and asked if she could sit in my car, explaining that the tellers wouldn't help her unless she was in a vehicle. Being young and naive, I agreed. We made small talk about the weather, local events, nothing too serious, until she suddenly shared something that chilled me to the bone. She said her husband had passed away a few years ago, and then casually added that she kept his body in her living room. Not his ashes or an urn, his actual body. She said she liked looking at him and that she changed his clothes often.